Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the Kentuckian. Glad that you've joined us as we continue our series on tanks here. Today, we will be talking about the main Russian tanks of World War II. I hope that you'll subscribe to stay tuned to what the Kentuckian has to offer, and let's jump into it. Russian tanks are a bit of an interesting topic. A lot happened in Soviet armor development and production. Some of it was really quite wild. We'll hit early, mid, and late war tanks as usual, and remember that tanks are very powerful when used correctly, but they're useless and even a liability when they're not properly deployed in combat. So let's jump into the cool stuff and talk about tanks. And believe me, the Soviet Union had a lot of them. Starting off with early war, the first tank I want to talk about wasn't as heavily produced as most of the others, but I decided to include it for a couple reasons. One of the main reasons being it's pretty cool, pretty interesting tank, and it's the T-35. This was a kind of a staple of interwar design. One of the popular things for interwar tank design was multiple turrets. The T-35, as you can tell, has a lot of them. It has 5 separate turrets. Multiple turrets aren't practical for a lot of reasons, but they used to be a very popular feature on early war and interwar tanks. The T-35 was a heavy tank with an extremely large crew, and as I mentioned, 5 turrets. The armament was moderate. It had mainly machine guns, but the main turret did have, the big turret in the middle did have a main gun. It was quite intimidating in a parade. It was quite a sight to see, but they were outmoded and obsolete, and with what little action they did see early in the war, they did not perform well. Now that brings us to the next tank, which is the somewhat more practical medium tank cousin of the T-35, the T-28. Now, over 500 of these were built, and although they still weren't very practical, they did see some use, and they were more practical than the T-35 was, but they were, again, basically obsolete when the war started. And even though there were attempts by the Soviets to upgrade them, they just did not perform well, and they were basically all out of service 2 months into the German invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa. So they did not last long, but there were several of them built, so they are significant in that sense. Just not very good, and they usually had a 75mm gun of some sort. Now we're getting into an early war Russian tank that is a bit more practical, the T-26. It was much more practical than actually the T-28 or especially the T-35, and it was a very heavily produced tank in early Soviet service. It was a light tank meant for infantry support. It wasn't super fast, but at the time it was originally designed, it was actually a pretty solid tank. It had a decent 45mm gun, and it was heavily based off of the British Vickers 6-ton light tank, or the Mark E, as you'll probably hear it referred to if you ever study it. Again, a decent tank for the beginning of the war, but as the technology developed very quickly, it quickly became obsolete. Also served significantly in the Spanish Civil War, where a lot of German and Russian tanks and aircraft and equipment and tactics were tested out before the war itself started. Now, another tank that served similarly to the T-26 was the BT-5 or the BT series of light tanks. Now, the BT series was a series of light breakthrough tanks. That's what the BT actually stands for. And it was based off of a design by an American designer with the last name of Christie. Now, that's significant because he designed a revolutionary suspension system for tanks called the Christie suspension. He originally built the BT tanks, which were actually very good tanks in many ways, especially for that period of the war and early interwar period, as a fast breakthrough tank that could take advantage of openings in enemy lines and that sort of thing and cause havoc. But he originally marketed them to the American military. The American military during the interwar period was just not interested in them. So eventually Russia ended up buying and buying some of them that were built, and he actually came over and helped them set up tank factories so they could build these BT series of tanks, BT-5 and the BT-7 primarily, but they built a lot of them, but they ended up being used in a way that wasn't very effective. As a fast, light breakthrough tank, they could do really well, but what happened, especially when Operation Barbarossa came along, that German invasion of Russia, they were put into defensive positions, basically, and they just didn't serve well. T-26 was in a similar position. They were getting outgunned, and they were not meant to just sit in a static position and try and hold off an enemy advance. And unfortunately, the BT-5, which was in many ways a sophisticated tank, was obsolete a large degree because of how it was used. Now, mid to late war, it would have been obsolete anyway. It was also armed with the same 45 millimeter gun that the the T-26, excuse me, was armed with. The BT-5 and the BT-7 were both armed with that gun. Let's talk about the T-60 for a minute. Now, the T-60 was a very heavily produced light tank of the early war. Very early on, it performed okay. It could be produced very cheaply and easily, but it was underpowered, and it had a small 20 millimeter cannon that struggled against German armor, and it was extremely small, which, like, oh, well, that means it's a smaller target. True, but it also means, and this is a characteristic of Russian tanks, most Russian tanks had this problem, the crew compartment was so small that it made it difficult for the crew to operate effectively. Now, there's tanks all throughout history that have had that problem. Russian tanks in particular ran into that. And even today, they tend to be on the smaller side and tend to be somewhat cramped compared to most other tanks out there today. But it served well for what it was. A cool thing about the T-60 for the Soviets was that a lot of smaller to medium factories could still produce these tanks, even though the more effective tanks like the T-34 we're talking about in a minute were better, and they would rather have them. They could produce the T-60. So it's one of those things, maybe it wasn't the best, but they could get a hold of it. But the T-60, along with its cousin the T-70, we'll talk about in a second, served on through the rest of the war. The T-70, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is the cousin to it. Really, it's just an upgraded version. It had a more powerful 45 millimeter gun, so it wasn't the little 20 millimeter. Not a great gun, but definitely better than the 20 millimeter cannon that was on the T-60. It had more armor, and it had a better power plant, so it was able to be a little bit faster. Again, just like the T-60, it was still obsolete very quickly. You could produce them cheaply and quickly, so they produced them in large numbers, but at the same time, not necessarily the best option if you could have something else. At the time, the Russians couldn't necessarily have something else. That brings us to the Soviet Union's first proper heavy tank, the KV-1. And I want to go ahead and say this here, and this happened with the other tanks that we've talked about as well. The Soviets experimented with their tanks a huge amount. They tried all sorts of different stuff. Different guns, different configurations, turrets, all sorts of different things to experiment around. Most of those experiments never entered production, but some of them did, and they entered small production. We're not going to talk about those variants, but I wanted to make that clear. The mainline, quote-unquote, KV-1s were well armored. They had a 76 millimeter gun. There was one of two guns that they tended to use. One was an older gun that didn't work extremely well. It was also on the T-34, and then they upgraded it. They were both 76 millimeter, but they upgraded it. It was much more effective, and that was on a lot of the KV-1s as well as a lot of the early T-34s. They had good armor, especially for the early war. There was very little that could actually penetrate a KV-1's armor, especially from the front. Very well, kind of serving the same role as a Tiger did, at least reputation-wise, but along with that, they were also very unreliable. They were a pain logistically. They were heavier than most other tanks, so they couldn't cross bridges that other tanks could. They were hard to keep running. They had transmission issues. Again, they performed well in battle if they were running, but they were a pain to keep running. They were a pain to keep on the battlefield. And they would be replaced, not as quick as the Soviets would have liked. They wanted to replace them quickly, but they would be replaced with other heavy tanks that were a bit more effective, and, as we'll talk about in a moment, the T-34. They were also slower, by the way, than a lot of the other Russian tanks, but in combat they could serve very well, and there's some reports of them taking out a lot of tanks, actually, a lot of German tanks in the proper situation. They were still vulnerable to infantry, as always, and then became more and more vulnerable to the more powerful guns that, of course, started to pop up everywhere later in the war, except maybe the Pacific, but that's another issue. We've talked about that a lot, though, with the German and the American tanks, so if you'd like to hear more about that, be sure to check out those videos. The other, and I won't spend much time on this, but there's another version of the KV-1 that was made during this period. It was the KV-2. Now, as you can see here in the pictures, this is a pretty wild-looking version of the KV-1, but it was designed as a bunker buster, so that really big gun on it's a 152 millimeter howitzer. They needed something that could deal with fortifications, static fortifications, and that 152 millimeter howitzer certainly could, but they made a custom turret for it in order to maintain, or in order to carry that gun. And the turret itself had a lot of issues. It's obviously very high profile. You can tell that just by looking at it. It was used in combat because it was available, but it really wasn't all that effective. It was a stopgap vehicle that was never really used for the intended bunker buster role. It looks cool. It looks kind of wild. It's kind of a well-known vehicle, but at least among tank enthusiasts, it just wasn't super effective for what it was. The turret wouldn't operate properly if the tank wasn't on level ground. There were a whole bunch of issues that, again, you've got it, so you're going to use it, especially at that stage in the war. But I wanted to mention it because it's famous. There were several of them made, and I believe it falls into that category of main Russian tanks. Now let's talk about the mid-war. The first tank I want to talk about is probably, if you know any Russian tank from World War II, if you know any tank at all, there's a very good chance it's a T-34. T-34 was a medium tank that came to be one of the most heavily produced tanks in history, if not the most produced tank in history. I forgot to double check that. I'll try and put it on the screen here so you know which one was the most produced. And it was quite effective when it was first introduced. Tank production for the T-34 was slow at first. There were a lot of things with the invasion of Germany, and the T-34 required more resources to build than some of those light tanks that we've talked about and so on. But when it was in combat early on, its sloped armor tended to be very resistant to most of the German guns that it was facing, the 50 millimeters and the 37 millimeters that tended to be on a lot of tanks back then at that point in the war. It was pretty mobile. It had pretty decent firepower with a 76 millimeter gun. Again, the same two guns that were on the KV-1. They're the same gun in practice, but there was some difference in how they were designed, so they would fit in the turrets differently because there were two different tanks. One of the problems with the T-34 is it was very cramped, especially the early variants. The turret was very small, was very cramped. The interior compartment in the hull was very cramped, and that affects the ability of the crew to actually use their tank effectively, right? You don't have much room to reload. You don't have much room to do anything, to drive, whatever you need to do. Big disadvantage. The 1942 versions and onward had a different turret that helped with that crew space a lot, although it still was always a cramped tank. But the early T-34s especially still had problems, and it tended to come down more to usage, the way they were used in battle, and the lack of experienced crews, the lack of experienced officers, because the Stalin himself had purged most of the officer corps, so they didn't have experienced officers in their military, even though they had a very large military, and the Soviets produced huge amounts of tanks. I mean, massive, mind-boggling amounts of tanks, especially for the interwar, before the war, early war period. But they couldn't use them well. Also, an interesting thing about tank production, I won't spend too long on this, but I do want to explain briefly. Operation Barbarossa, Germany invades Russia, and they are annihilating Russian forces. They're pushing Russian forces back. It's very bad for the Russian military. Basically, what they did is they said, "Hey, we need tanks, and one of the reasons we're struggling is because we simply cannot get enough tanks to sustain our losses." So they looked and they said, "Well, how long does a Russian tank? How long does a T-34 survive?" On average, a T-34 would survive about 2 weeks once it was in the field. So they said, okay, on average, we need a Russian tank. We need a T-34 to survive for 2 weeks. So what they did in order to up their production numbers is they basically cut quality on everything except for the gun and said, all right, we are putting the absolute bare minimum amount of effort into building these things so that they run for that 2 weeks. So they started churning out, again, the gun was good, but everything else they really cut back on. So they started producing huge numbers of tanks. They weren't very high quality. And again, it wasn't necessarily a design issue. It was a production issue. And it was a choice that was made, more or less. But it was a conscious choice to say, look, they're probably not going to survive. Hey, if your crew survives, I guess you can either try and repair the old T-34 or just give them a new one because you're producing so many tanks. That changed later in the war, but in the early to mid-war period, that became the strategy because they just had to churn out as many tanks as possible, and it was quite effective for that. It worked. It was a war of attrition, right? It was throw stuff in the meat grinder, but it worked. So that's a little bit of an interesting side note there. Another vehicle I want to talk about briefly is the Su-76. Now, this was an extremely heavily produced self-propelled gun on the chassis of the T-70, which we talked about earlier. That was the upgraded version of the T-60, and it was better, especially from one of the areas it was upgraded was the drivetrain power plant area, particularly the power plant, where it had a 76 millimeter gun on it, and it was just a gun carrier. Wasn't very well armored. It was very simple. It was open compartment. The crew compartment was exposed. That's what that means. Not well armored, not necessarily the fastest, although it was decently mobile, and extremely simple. But that simplicity and the effectiveness of the gun, and it was used a lot for infantry support, but it could deal with some tanks. It was simple, available, and effective. It did what it was supposed to. Over 14,000 of these tanks were produced, and, well, self-propelled guns is probably more accurate, and they were very effective. Yeah, they weren't going to take on a Tiger or a Panther unless they got maybe in an ambush position and could shoot the side or something, but they served well, and they did decent against tanks as well. Another tank, and this was the first in a series of Soviet assault guns that was inspired by the Stug assault gun that we talked about in our video on German tanks, was the Su-122. Now, the Su-122 was a pretty effective self-propelled gun based on the chassis of the T-34. So it's a case tank destroyer. We've talked about that, where you, instead of a turret, you have an armored case with the gun fixed in it. Very effective, but it was on the chassis of the T-34, which was a pretty mobile, decent platform, and it had a very powerful 122 millimeter howitzer. It was especially used against fortification and as artillery, but it could be very effective against tanks just because of the raw explosive mass in the high explosive shell that the Su-122 tended to fire. Another version of the Su-122 is the Su-85. Now, instead of being a infantry support artillery-based weapon, the Su-85 was a tank destroyer. It was armed with a new gun that had been developed, a powerful 85 millimeter anti-tank gun, and it was meant as a tank destroyer. The Su-122, even the Su-76, were meant more as infantry support and indirect or artillery fire sort of situations. This was meant as a tank destroyer. They couldn't mass produce the T-34 with the 85 millimeter yet, and they needed those guns available, so they built the Su-85. Over 2,500 of these units were built, which is a pretty good number, but the gun was eventually able to be mounted on the T-34 for mass production, and they stopped producing the Su-85. And then the last mid-war tank that I want to talk about is the Su-152. Now, this was a self-propelled gun as well, and the Soviets loved their self-propelled guns, but it allowed, and it was designed to allow, for easier transport of these very heavy 152 millimeter howitzers that the Soviets used. Most artillery pieces early in the war for the Soviets were towed. You get caught in mud, you get any kind of issue, and they're just a pain to try and use. And in fact, these 152 millimeter howitzers tended to be abandoned if they got stuck because they were that heavy and hard to work with. So the Soviets wanted a vehicle that could carry this. It ended up being, one, an effective self-propelled gun in general, but it actually ended up being a very effective tank destroyer, simply due, again, to how much raw explosive was in the HE shell, the high explosive shell, that the 152 millimeter howitzer fired. And similar to the 122, but just dial it up a couple notches because it was a more powerful gun, more powerful howitzer. It could even deal with Tigers and stuff if it got a direct hit. And they actually tended to use this vehicle as an impromptu, what they called heavy tank destroyer. Very effective. They were cheap and they were easy to produce. As with most Russian tanks, it was cramped, and its armor was only adequate even in the mid-war period. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. And that brings us to the late war Russian tanks. The first one I want to talk about, and we won't talk about it long actually, for what you'll probably see as obvious reasons, this is the T-34-85. Now, I mentioned this vehicle a moment ago. This is where the Soviets were able to mount the new 85 millimeter anti-tank gun on the T-34 for mass production. Now, as you can see, there's significant differences with the turret, and that's basically what it was. It was a completely different turret than the older models of the T-34 to even have room to put the 85 millimeter gun on it. And actually, not only was a huge number of these vehicles produced, they were produced after the war, especially in Soviet bloc countries during the Cold War. There were other countries that produced this same tank for years after the war. And it's one of the tanks that are still fairly common to use for a World War II tank. Now, that's nowhere near as common as they were back then, but there's very few World War II tanks still used. The T-34-85 is one of them. It was fairly versatile. It was a reliable vehicle. It served well until the end of the war and after, as I mentioned. And its armor at this point in the war wasn't very good. It worked for what it was, kind of like the Sherman. The Sherman's armor, which we talked about in the American video, was not great, but at that point in the war, it might have been upgraded a little bit, and it served well for what you needed it to serve well for. T-34-85 was the same way. Now I want to talk about the IS-2. The IS-2 was the heavy tank produced in decent numbers, and it was the first really practical heavy tank that the Soviets developed and mass-produced. There was an IS-1, but there weren't very many of them made. There were some modifications of the KV tank that I mentioned that were more effective, but there weren't very many of them made as well. The IS-2 was mass-produced. It mounted an extremely large and powerful 122 millimeter tank gun. As you can see in the pictures, it's a huge looking gun. It's long, it's got a massive muzzle brake on the end, and it could outperform most German guns of the time. And from what I can tell, it wasn't a strictly anti-tank gun either. A lot of the guns that the Soviets tended to have on their vehicles were, well, they were usually just called tank guns from what I'm seeing, and they were kind of, from what I can tell, a multi-purpose gun. There's not much record on the kind of action it saw during the war. It looks, at least against enemy armor, it looks like it didn't necessarily see a lot of action against enemy armor during World War II, but when it did, it tended to do extremely well, from what I can tell. It was also a very reliable and user-friendly tank. Compared to like the KV-1 and even other Russian tanks, excluding the T-34, it was actually pretty good. And that brings me to the next tank, which was the next step in the IS series. And I want to make a quick note what the IS stands for. Generally, the letters stand for the producer or maybe the designer of the whatever vehicle we're talking about. The IS was kind of interesting. It is based off the Russian word for Joseph Stalin. The next one, though, was called the IS-3, and there were actually several ISs made after the war. The IS-3 was technically too late to actually see action, as the earliest units arrived in the field after Germany had surrendered, although supposedly the IS-3 fought with some Jagdpanthers, which we talked about in the German video, if you want to check that out, after the surrender. That's unconfirmed, and with Russian communist propaganda being what it is, a lot of their stuff tends to be exaggerated or made up, so you have to take it with a little more grain of salt. But supposedly it might have seen a little action after the war technically ended. The IS-3, interestingly enough, did take part in a victory parade in Berlin right after the war. The interesting part about that is the Allies, I should say, didn't know it existed or didn't know anything about the IS-3, and all of a sudden this massive, crazy-looking heavy tank, which you can tell from the pictures, shows up. And those Soviets have it, and of course at this point, everybody's kind of concerned what's going to happen with the Soviets. Caused quite a stir, however, and it did mount the same gun as the IS-2, however, even though it was much better armored, and in some ways fairly sophisticated, it was kind of a logistical repair nightmare, and in fact there were some production issues where the hull itself could even crack. It wasn't a very well produced tank, it wasn't a very good tank, but it looked scary, and that was really perhaps the greatest effect that it had. Some of those issues were fixed later as they continued to produce the tank for a while, but it really wasn't that great of a tank, especially early on, and it was probably never as dangerous as it looked. But it's an interesting tank. I think it's a very cool looking heavy tank, and it does have an important place in World War II history. And there's a handful of other tanks I want to talk about for the late war period. We won't spend too long on these, but they're all tank destroyers or casemate vehicles, as we've talked about a few already. I told you earlier they love their self-propelled guns. So the first are two vehicles in the ISU series. Now, the ISU series first was produced in greater numbers than the SU series, and especially the ISU 152 in particular, which was the upgraded version of the SU 152. And the SU 152 served well and everything. The ISU was on the much more advanced IS chassis, like the IS-2 was built on. It performed effectively the same role as the SU-152, and it served well. There were about twice as many of these made as there was the SU-152. There was also a tank destroyer version that there were several produced of, and it was the ISU-122 or the ISU-122S, depending on the variant. And there are multiple variants, but the S was perhaps a bit more common. It mounted the 122 millimeter gun meant for an anti-tank role, and very similar to the one on the IS-2, but not quite the same, especially on the first 122s. The 122S mounted a very similar or same gun as the IS-2. It was produced in significant numbers, and it served decently well. It is what it is. It was a tank destroyer with a very big, effective gun, and they used them. And the final tank I want to talk about today is another, as I mentioned, case tank destroyer, or self-propelled gun. This is a tank destroyer, and it's the SU-100. Now, this is the upgun version of the SU-85, and it served extremely well as a tank destroyer. It had a 100 millimeter gun, being one of, if not the most powerful anti-tank weapon that the Soviets had at their disposal during the war. It also had upgraded armor from the SU-85. maybe still not great by that standard, but definitely better and a definite improvement. And it had respectable protection. And it's one of the Soviet vehicles that was still produced after the war and is still in use today. Now, generally the Su-100 is not going to see frontline service, but oftentimes they'll be in reserve units. And reportedly, the Russians still have a lot of Su-100s in like storage in reserve. They took them out of active reserve several years ago, but most of them several years ago, but they supposedly still have a very, very large number in storage. Maybe they'll come out during this war with Ukraine, who knows. But kind of an interesting thing there that Su-100 served very well and still serves today to some degree. That brings us to the end of this episode. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I know I enjoy making these, although a little bit different than what I normally do. And I hope that you will consider subscribing, liking the video. I'm really getting good momentum with these videos, so I'm trying to kind of leap on that a little bit. And if you like what I do here, please consider supporting me. Don't forget that there's a lot of social media where you can keep up with what's going on. Those are all linked in the description of this episode. And don't forget about the merchandise store. I'm going to hopefully be adding some new things on there very soon, and you can get some cool merchandise and support the Kentuckian at the same time. And remember that if you'd like to support me in a more personal way, my Patreon is also linked in the description of this episode. Hope that you all have a wonderful week. Hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. This has been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.